Welcome. My name is Narasimhan, and it is my great pleasure on behalf of the Water Resources Center Archives to welcome you all for this fourth and the last of the colloquia for this semester. We have 4 colloquia for each semester, and this is the fourth and last for this spring 2004 semester. And at this time, it is my great pleasure to recognize and thank the people who are supporting this venture of public education, in which faculty, student, and the public all come together to learn something from distinguished speakers. Financially, and also morally and intellectually, this colloquium series is supported by several deans. The deans of engineering, natural resources, letters and science, Bolt Hall School of Law, College of Environmental Design, and we also have support from the Executive Vice President and Provost Paul Gray. In addition to all this, the Groundwater Resources Association of the State of California, a group of professionals who have some of whom have attended this colloquia, have generously donated some money too for the furtherance of this cause. And we are all thankful to all of them. In addition, logistically, this colloquium is the result of the staff of the Water Resources Center Archives, Linda Vida, Nancy Nowitsky, and a few others. Without their hard work, things won't go on smoothly here. And finally, I am very fortunate to have the counsel and help of several faculty members from around the campus: Professor Joseph Sachs from Law, Michael Hanneman from Agriculture Resource Economics, David Sedlak from Civil Engineering, and Matt Condall from Environmental Design. So we all sit together, think of names to invite, and then we invite, and then things go on. And so that's how this entire thing goes. And so we have particular pleasure that this year everything has went on smoothly, and we already have decided on the speakers for our fall semester, all the 4 speakers. We have a very, very nice group of speakers for the fall, and you will all get the announcement via email and otherwise, which Linda has set up so nicely. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Mr. David Kennedy, former director, retired director of the California Department of Water Resources. He is going to talk today about the evolution of water policy in California, which should be of enormous educational value for all of us. We have heard so much about water that it will be nice to hear from somebody from a position of authority who has known things, to tell us how water policy gets formulated in Sacramento. Very briefly, the greatest pleasure we have about Mr. Kennedy's presence here today is that he is the alumnus of this campus. He got both his bachelor and master's degree in civil engineering here at Berkeley. He served between 1959 and 1961 with the Army Corps of Engineers. Then between 63 and 68, he served in various capacities in the Department of Water Resources. Then in 68, he accepted a position with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, where he continued till 1983. Between 1974 and 83, he was a deputy general manager. And then in 1983, he was appointed by Governor Duke Majian to be the Director of the Department of Water Resources. And his appointment was continued by Governor Pete Wilson, and Mr. Kennedy retired in 1998. And we are indeed very fortunate that we have him today to tell us about how water policy has evolved in California. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Nari, for that very gracious introduction. It's, I thought as he started to introduce me, he had a line in there about I was going to tell you the way that policy is formed in Sacramento. And I never did figure that out. So when he asked me to speak some months ago, I got a call from Nari and Professor Dave Todd, who was one of my professors both as an undergraduate and graduate school. When you've been gone for 5 years, you kind of wonder what you might have to say that would be interesting. And so what came out of my thinking about it was that possibly I could put in perspective what happened, what changed over the roughly 40 years that I worked, the time from when I finished here at Cal to when I retired. Lots of things did change with respect to water policy. And it might be interesting to you younger people to see what has, kind of where we came from to where we are today. Now, the people that are my generation, and there are quite a few friends out there that know every bit as much about this as I do and undoubtedly have a different perspective, I would appreciate it if they would refrain from wagging their heads each time that I've got to tell you one little joke about that. Years ago in California, we had a issue called the Peripheral Canal. And if anybody hasn't heard of it, ask your neighbor later. But it was very, very controversial in the 70s, and it finally came to a head in the 1982 election. I found myself down as Metropolitan Water District engineer and a manager down there, assistant manager, of having to explain this in a lot of forums, not unlike this. And one time I was in San Francisco, I think it was an American Society of Civil Engineering meeting, and group about like this, and there was a fellow in the front row who I did not recognize at all, that almost everything he said, I got the old head nod wave, and I knew that I was not making any friends, that he clearly had a different view of this. Now, I had not worked on the Peripheral Canal. I had learned it from other people. When I was at the department earlier than that, I didn't work on it. So anyway, he asked a very pointed question or two, as obvious, and finally it occurred to me who he was. His name was Emilio Gomez, and Joe Gomez, and Joe had been chief planner of the Corps of Engineers in Sacramento for 40 years. He was retired when he sat in the front row with me, but he was a legend in California as a very bright water planner, just an exceedingly capable guy who had been very involved in the Peripheral Canal. Well, you can't talk to somebody on their issue and get it right. So fortunately, when I walked up to say hello to him afterwards, I said, "And you're Joe Gomez, aren't you?" Well, his face lit up. So we had a good visit. But this time I'm going to ask those of you that know more than what I'm talking about, just save it for afterwards. And Joe Sachs, Joe and I use the expression, we were in the war together. Not the big war. This was the Colorado River War. The few years before I retired, I got somehow, that's never been clear to me, I got maneuvered into working on the Colorado River negotiations 2 or 3 days a week, which was not in my job description, I can assure you. And Joe was working for then Secretary Babbitt as a very special representative on these matters. So we spent a lot of time together, and he was one of the very constructive forces in trying to get a difficult problem straightened out. Now, the fact that they signed an agreement after I left, I think, has probably got a message in it too. But in any event, when you talk about evolution of a policy over 40 years, inherently it's a personal perspective. Everybody who would write this up would have a different bunch of things they emphasize. So these are going to be really, it's a retrospective from my standpoint of the kinds of things that have made an impression on me, both as this all went on and as I look back all these years later. Kind of a beginning point for me was when I was in the service down at Fort Ord. I'd taken ROTC here, got commissioned as a lieutenant, and spent most of the 2 years down at Fort Ord, renting a little house in Carmel, and my wife taught in Pacific Grove. Now, is that a bad Army duty or what? Anyway, at the November 60 election, it's the same election that John Kennedy was elected President of the United States. There was a measure on the ballot that had been put there by the California legislature and Governor Brown to finance the state water project. This was called the Burns-Porter Act, after the two legislators had put it together. It was approved by the legislature and the governor in June '59. It went to election for ratification in 1960, November 60. I was a few months from getting out of the service. There was a great deal of publicity about the water project. I thought, gee, this is interesting. When I was here as an undergraduate, I was in structural engineering and had thought that's what I'd go back to get my master's in. But I got very intrigued by the water program when it was discussed in the ballot. So it was barely approved at that election in November of '60. I decided when I came back in the fall of '61 to switch from structures to water resources, and that's how I happened to get my master's here in water resources. June of '62, I went to work for the Department of Water Resources in Sacramento. At that point, we had 4,500 people. Much of the staff was involved in design and construction of the state water project. They were really getting into full construction program, starting in the north with Oroville, which had actually started construction earlier, Oroville Dam, and then proceeding south. And they finished in '72 or '3. I worked on design a little bit, but then I found my greater interest was in planning. And I think when I found myself sitting at a design table, kind of looking at the dozens of other guys at design table, and I'd look over there, and a little bit of that went a long way with me. So I decided to shift over into planning, where it's a little bit more subjective, and you get into finances and statutes and contracts. And I found just through experience that that was what really interested me. So when I went up there, I started in design, but I shifted over into planning. And the 6.5 years I remained at the department, I was in planning. Spent some time on the North Coast planning, actually. They were going to build a bunch of dams up there. And then I shifted over to statewide planning, where we got into long-range population projections, year 2020. If you're working in 1962 on something in the year 2020, that's a long way off. One frame of reference that I look back on that many of you have heard of, the California Water Plan. This was a plan that had been developed by the department over about a 7-year period. In 1957-58, it was published, big, thick document. And it was widely misunderstood, but on the other hand, the nature of it, that was almost inevitable. What it was a survey of water supply reservoir opportunities throughout the entire state in sort of an ultimate projection of what California might need. It was not really supposed to be a construction plan or here's what we're going to do, so much as if we do have this huge population growth, 50 million people by the year 2020, which may not be all that far off, is it possible to provide water for them? And interestingly, the whole frame of reference was building dams, aqueducts, very conventional stuff. That had been published in '57. What I was working on was the reconnaissance studies in the North Coast following up on the water plan. And people were getting quite serious about building dams, getting them authorized, financed, whatnot, up in the North Coast area. All that's long history, which long behind us. Never going to happen now. But in 1962, that was the perspective that most water engineers, economists had about where California was going to go with its future water program. Now, what's changed? I've got 3 themes that I'm going to elaborate on. One is environmental protection. That has been possibly the most significant change, and I'm going to go over this in more detail, as to what has happened in 40 years to completely change the ballgame. The second thing is, partly because of the first, non-structural approaches to water supply or non-conventional approaches are much more significant now and will be forever than they were considered 40 years ago. Some of the things considered today just were not thought of in those days, or were considered very abstract and theoretical. And then the third theme that has struck me is there is much more coordination and cooperation among water agencies than there was ever dreamed of 40 years ago. There's probably 300 water agencies in this state that have some significant responsibility. They, generally speaking, have a good working relationship, and as I'm going to outline, there is now a lot of coordination and cooperation among these agencies. One of the changes that's had no downside whatsoever. Now, what's the context as to where we are today? And I wanted to just say a few words about that because it kind of sets the stage for my remaining comments. First of all, California has a statewide system of water facilities. I use the word system thinking about it a little bit. It was not conceived of as a system. It was conceived of as a whole lot of separate projects. Today, we can now start to think of it as a system of components working together, not completely, but much more than was ever thought of. We have, I think it's about 1,100 dams and reservoirs that are licensed by the state, regulated by the state. That's a lot of them, more than any other state. We have aqueducts, pipelines running all over the state. If you had looked at a map of California with the aqueducts and pipelines, it looks like a highway map because there are so many going on. Groundwater basins, they have always been significant, but they're becoming much more significant. The people that are managing systems today are much more imaginative about what might be done to stretch these groundwater resources, which are far greater than our reservoirs, our surface reservoirs. We have huge groundwater reserves in the state. There's a lot of thought being given now and a lot of specific plans being worked out. Significantly, this system has a lot of different owners. It's not owned by the state or the feds or local districts. It's owned by hundreds of entities. Now, the state and the feds are the two biggest, but there are other large districts, Metropolitan Water District in the south, East Bay, Contra Costa here. The Hetch Hetchy system owned by San Francisco is a big system, but there's hundreds of other individual systems. That is, entities that have title, that have a board of directors, that nobody can tell them what to do without a process. There's somebody to negotiate with. This so-called system just has a whole lot of separate pieces. I guess in one sense, a little bit like the internet, and that people use this thing that has no single ownership. Here's another part of the context and overview of where we are. The population growth continues. We have long since passed the point where you can run for office in this state on a pro-growth platform. You actually could 40 years ago. I don't think it's possible anywhere in California today, and yet it just keeps happening. The projections that we made, or that we worked with 40 years ago on population, have become much closer to reality than any of us would have thought. So the population growth just continues, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. Significantly, irrigated agriculture is level, or, it depends on where you are in the state, or is declining. Very few parts of California it's actually going up. It's basically going up in a few places where people are putting vineyards on hillsides. But for the most part, agriculture leveled off at about 9.5 million acres and is gradually going down, and it will continue to go gradually down for a long time. But when ag's using 75% of the developed water and it's at 9.5 million acres, or 9, that's a lot of water with a long way to go. A few anomalies in this that, that kind of strike me. dairies have become a much bigger deal now than they were 40 years ago. If you drive up and down the Sacramento Valley now, you see lots of dairies. Dairies use hay. Hay needs water, not necessarily good. I think we're now the #1 dairy state in the country. I'll stand to be corrected, but I think that's right. You can ask yourself, why is a semi-arid state growing enough hay to be the #1 dairy state in the nation? I won't answer the question because I'm not sure I've got it figured out. Other anomalies, cotton is going down, oranges are going down. My wife's family has grown oranges for about 110 years in Ventura County. Last time we were there a year ago, many of those old orchards are gone, and people have put in row crops. So some of those things that we took for granted, like oranges, are gone. Cotton has been, of course, artificially supported for a long time, and from what I read in the paper, it's probably on borrowed time too. Okay, now I'm going to shift over into these 3 general themes of what's changed. And the first is environmental protection. We now have new statutes, court decrees, regulations, all kinds of legal arrangements to protect the environment, most of which were not even thought of 40 years ago. NEPA and CEQA, the Environmental Quality Acts of the state and federal governments, that require full disclosure and mitigation for practically anything you do. These are very powerful tools now in requiring a full consideration of whatever anybody's thinking about doing and bringing the public in. A very public process today. Endangered Species Acts, both state and federal. Now, one could argue, why do we need both? I think I've even made that, or argued that question, but nevertheless, they're there. And they are among the toughest statutes on the books. I remember the first time that I ran into the federal act, I tend to get out whatever the court decision is that governs things, because I'm always curious. Let me give you a little. When your attorney tells you this is the way it is, ask a lot of questions, because the way that he's saying it is one way it is. There's probably other ways that it might be, and it really takes a lot of debate to find out what does the law require. It's very rare that the law requires something very specific. Well, endangered species, what struck me about that U.S. Supreme Court decision, I think it was the Tellico case in '77, the justices said this objective of endangered species protection is of the highest priority. The highest priority. You don't find that in statutes or in court decisions much. They said, they had another great expression, whatever the cost. I spent much of my life as a public administrator. There is no such concept of whatever the cost. That's in the Supreme Court decision for endangered species. Well, when you become aware of that, and the biologists tell you, you've got to shut down your pumps because there's an endangered species issue here, you tend to take it very seriously. And that's a whole new ballgame that's evolved over about the last 30 years. Wild and scenic rivers protection. My first 3 years with DWR, we worked on building or designing, planning dams up in the north coastal rivers, the wettest part of California. A third of our runoff is up there as a state. Klamath, Eel River, Van Dusen, all those. Those are now completely off limits, both state and federal law. You don't even think about a dam up there. Now, fortunately, the economics of doing something up there wouldn't be very good anyway. So if I sound like an engineer doesn't get to build a dam, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying the law has completely changed. And there are now wild and scenic rivers all over the place. Generally speaking, they have very broad public support. And generally speaking, I think all the engineers who had their hearts set on building dams have long ago forgotten about it, and it's not on anybody's radar anymore. It's just one of the restrictions. Public trust doctrine. Now I'm getting into Joe Sachs teaches water law over there at the So now I'm really getting out on thin ice, but here's the engineer's interpretation. When the Mono Lake case came down, basically, I think what the state Supreme Court said is a water right is not eternal if it might impact public resources. That public resources have kind of an eternal potential protection to be weighed in the balance. And you can't go into court and say, we don't give a hoot about those public resources because we got our water right, we got it 80 years ago, get out of here. Now the justices can say, whoops, the water board has a right to weigh it all in the balance and see what the issue is. It doesn't automatically take anything away, but it does give you the opportunity to raise a question. And, you know, in reflection, many of us would say, so what's wrong with that? It does, in some people's fear, cast long-standing water rights into jeopardy. In the real world, I don't think very much has happened because of it. And I'm not aware of really anything that's happened that has become some horrific story. And then generally, excuse me, water quality protection is much more refined today than it was years ago. Part of it is because we found out a lot of things about public health and water quality we didn't know about, or species protection and water quality. Lots more science today than there was years ago. There's also ability to measure at a much finer detail, parts per billion, trillion, things. I joked years ago when we found out that these things were starting to come up. You cannot take a glass of water out of the Sierra, rainfall, without probably finding almost everything that's ever been manufactured by man in that glass if you have the proper equipment. Now, the real question is, so what does it mean? I've noticed in the clip sheets that the standard for arsenic is about to be lowered by state health. And we'd all say that's great. They're going to lower it below a detection level. Now, it wasn't clear to me from the articles, and I think that's probably because the person writing the articles wasn't clear. Is this a goal or a standard? I think it's a goal and they're calling it a standard. I don't think you can enforce something you can't measure. But the articles are making a big point out of the goal that's being set as we stand here by the state of California. It's, somebody correct me if I get this wrong, 1,000 times more stringent than what the federal government's talking about. Well, 40 years from now, we all may say, thank God now we can do it. That was a good idea. But at the moment, it kind of illustrates how far we're going. Now, what's driven all this? Factors driving all these changes in environmental protection. Well, first of all, there is general resistance among all of us to population growth and sprawl and environmental degradation. I don't think anybody much is trying to argue the case anymore that it's okay to degrade the environment because we need this so much. You may find an isolated case, but usually it's more an argument about what the standard should be rather than the concept. There is very broad public support all across, well, the nation for environmental protection. Now, one aspect of that is the NGOs. Today we have many, many NGOs that are, well, I would say, well-funded. They might argue that, but they show up everywhere. They're very articulate. They're good scientists, lawyers. They're people who can make a career out of this. And so when you go into a hearing today or any kind of a public forum to consider some problem about a water project, you're not only meeting the agencies that you traditionally would have dealt with, the resource protection agencies, you're also dealing with very effective NGO advocates who have made a tremendous difference throughout the entire country, including here in California. Now, all of these things have happened not in the abstract. All of these changes have been made largely through one fight after another, not actually in sequence, a lot of them going on at a given time. Everything that has changed has been very hotly debated. This wasn't people thinking up theories about the way the world might be. somebody might think up something, but then they had to go get mixed up in a difficult confrontation. They had to have the stamina. Water controversies go on and on and on. They're not for the faint of heart or the weakest stomach or those who tire easily. They just go on and on. So that's some thoughts about environmental protection. Now, I mentioned earlier a second theme was non-structural, but a better way might say non-conventional approaches now predominate. And really what I mean by that is that conventional dams on streams, there aren't going to be any more. In fact, my theory is that federal law probably prohibits construction of a dam on a stream. You can build one off-stream, and that's why there have been 4 built recently, off-stream storage projects. But I can't conceive today of a dam being built, certainly on a live stream or a stream that's got any fish, but I think even an ephemeral stream you might have your hands full because you'd have wetlands, you bring in all the might of the federal government. When you bring them in, you don't only bring in the local people here in California, you bring in people from across the nation. When Auburn Dam was stopped in the Congress here a few years ago, it was interesting to me that it had pretty strong support in some parts of California. Our people in Sacramento, and I don't mean this in any way as a pejorative, but we have a pretty liberal city government up there. They were for it. They got back east. The people that blocked Auburn Dam as much as anything were conservative Republicans from the East Coast. I thought it was an interesting observation at the time. So dams on streams, let me know if there's one being proposed, because it's the exception that proves the rule. Another one that is, I think, going to be a thing of the past is new aqueducts. Now, there's probably a few exceptions, but another thing I can't conceive is building a second aqueduct out of the Delta, or a third or fourth or fifth. I mean, depending on which ones you want to count, we've got, there are 4 or 5 aqueducts tapping the Delta right now. If somebody were to propose building a new aqueduct down there, well, you know what's going to happen. There will not be another aqueduct into Southern California. The one that goes over the Tehachapis right now, that's it. In the California Water Plan, you'd probably find a proposal for a second aqueduct. Forget it. I don't think you could get Southern California to agree that they'd have another aqueduct, let alone Northern California. So now there's a few things that are going to happen. There's going to be a 6th pipeline built from Riverside down to San Diego. I think that's probably going to go forward. For some reason, what San Diego does, that pipeline is sort of below many people's environmental radar, and they've got a good case for why they need it. But it really is an exception. There aren't going to be any more conventional aqueducts in this state. Now, the non-conventional, to me, are the off-stream storage projects. We've had 4 or 5 built in the last 10 years or so. Large projects. Los Vaqueros, not far from here. Diamond Valley in Southern California, $2 billion project. A couple others. These are projects that basically were not on a live stream, and they are filled by pumping water in the wintertime. We, the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation, jointly built San Luis Reservoir in the 60s. That's a very large project on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. If you drive over Highway 152, you go right by it. Sometime when you go by there, remind yourself all this vast lake, 2 million acre feet, was pumped in from the Delta. Now, at the moment, that's been accepted as something that can be done. Although there's a proposed off-stream storage project up at a location on the west side of the Sacramento Valley called SITES, S-I-T-E-S, SITES site. Forgive me. SITES is a family name. It's the site of the SITES Reservoir. Now, you try explaining that to an elected official. Anyway, that's still a live proposal. May happen, but I've seen quite a bit of environmental opposition to it that had started to develop before I retired, so I will be pretty surprised if that all goes forward. And there's really a question there, too, about who would pay for it. Conservation, wastewater reclamation will increase. There's no question that conservation, every water agency in this state has a water conservation program that they are proud of. They spend money on it. They're serious about it. They see the advantage of it. We, in the 70s, kind of went through the debate between the water managers and the pro-water conservation people. The drought of 77, 76, 77 kind of, I think, cured most of the water managers of that, of trying to fight that issue. So today, you've got conservation and increasingly wastewater reclamation as viable parts of the water system in many parts of the state. Wastewater reclamation has a little bit of a problem at times. If you went back to the standards of water quality that were used in the 60s, you'd probably find much more wastewater reclamation than there is. But as we've been able to find more things in water, some of which are not very good and shouldn't be there, then wastewater reclamation takes on a greater and greater burden at trying to prove that it's not going to hurt somebody. But it nevertheless is going forward, often with a system in which it is not put into the potable system, but instead used for landscaping. But there's other places in Southern California, I think in the South Bay area, where there's a little bit of, well, in Southern California, more than a little bit, there's wastewater getting into the groundwater basins by design, where it's mixed with the fresh water and then recycled. And then another observation about why things have changed with respect to structures. That is that agriculture cannot afford to pay for new storage projects. Now that may sound like almost, of course they can't, but when the State Water Project was built 40 years ago, Ag signed up for 35%, I think it is, of the total project supply, and they paid their share of the costs of San Luis Reservoir and Oroville Reservoir. There was no subsidy to Ag from the other users for those two reservoirs, in spite of a lot of things you would have read during the Peripheral Canal debate. So the Ag users in the state project have paid their full share. It's one of the reasons that they've taken land out of production, because they can't afford to continue to pay for those high power costs down the San Joaquin Valley. They are open today. This is contrast to maybe 20 years ago. Today they're pretty open that they can't afford new storage projects. Don't even want to talk about it. That makes a big difference in what gets suggested. Now, you can contrast the subsidies with the Bureau of Reclamation's program, in which there was a historic subsidy for many, many years that the Congress deliberately put into the program. No apologies. This is the way we're settling the West. It was thought of as a good idea. Over time, a lot of things changed. By the 60s, people were beginning to question whether it's a good idea. By the 80s, it was more than that. And eventually, you got the Central Valley Project Reform Act, which Congressman Miller and Senator Bill Bradley put together, that changed a lot of the subsidies with the CVP. So I think they've still got some, but much less than they had at one time. But as far as any future subsidies, nobody is going to subsidize agriculture in the future that I am aware of. Now, the last general theme I wanted to lay out there was this coordination and cooperation. And you have to put this in the context of water agencies historically did not cooperate very well. I remember when San Francisco has what they think of as a federal water right. They get their water from Yosemite Park, the Hetch Hetchy part of Yosemite Park. They got an act of Congress, and I think it was 1914, that gave them this right. They basically told the state of California, when it came to records or anything, get lost. We don't have to give you anything. And that was sort of the attitude they projected. And they frankly did not participate with the rest of the state. And there were many other parts of California. Los Angeles had an attitude problem. Now, Los Angeles was one of the, well, I'll tell you why I say that. Los Angeles helped form the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. They first built the Owens Valley Aqueduct, and then in the late 20s, they saw that wasn't going to be enough. So they took the lead with a number of cities in Southern California to go to the legislature and get a statute passed that authorized formation of a Metropolitan Water District. The only one that's ever been formed is the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Every once in a while, somebody thinks about forming such a district in the Bay Area, but I doubt if that's ever going to happen. But in any event, so Metropolitan Water District was formed. They built the Colorado River Aqueduct. They contracted with first the federal government for Hoover Water. Then they contracted with the state for state water. They serve most of Southern California. They're the villain in many of the dramas. But Los Angeles, while they've always been the largest part of Metropolitan, they only had their share of the vote, and they took kind of a hands-off or stay away from us with respect to the Owens Valley Aqueduct. They never permitted any exchange with the Owens Valley Aqueduct, historically. They would not let any non-Los Angeles user contract for water from it. They had a theory that if that ever gets started, it'll never stop. So they took a very tough position. And this kind of view was often the case with irrigation districts in the Central Valley, where you had competition, some antagonism. You just had a lot of feeling of, well, we're doing our own thing and we don't care what the neighbor's doing. Well, much of that has changed. The fact that you can't build much anymore in the way of new facilities, and the fact that there are now such strong environmental restrictions, not only on building new things, but on operating what you've already built, has forced the water people, the water managers throughout California, to go much closer together in trying to work out these problems. In some ways, it's every bit as much as of a change as the environmental thing by itself. Generally, while there are some intramural contests, like between San Diego, who's a member of MET, and MET itself, and that's, my sense of it is, it's not completely settled down. Nevertheless, generally speaking, the southern districts work well with the Bay Area districts. The Bay Area districts work pretty well together. On a given issue, they'll have a strong disagreement. But it's pretty civil discourse, and they've worked out a lot of arrangements among themselves. What are some of these things? Well, physical interconnections. I remember during the 76-77 drought, when San Francisco almost ran out of water, the state dumped some water in one of their reservoirs where the South Bay Aqueduct crossed it, just to save them, basically. San Francisco had no way to hook into anybody else's system other than this jerry-rig thing. To their credit, they realized afterwards they needed to sit down and work something out. We went through the 91-91 drought with a temporary connection with San Francisco and a state project. After that, with their money, we built a connection so they can now take water. They've got to get the water somewhere. We're not giving them any water, but they've now got a physical connection to the state system. The people of San Francisco and their whole project, they serve 20 cities south of San Francisco. They're all better off for that. And there's really been a good spirit of cooperation. Another category of cooperation is exchange contracts. I'll give you one example that I got a kick out of because I was involved in it. Marin County, I think we'd all agree, Marin County is kind of different, right? In the Bay Area, they got some different points of view. Well, they were originally going to be part of the State Water Project. Well, they decided in the early 60s, forget it. They didn't want to be part of the state project. So the state said, fine, they weren't forcing it down their throats. So they basically walked away from what they might have had. Well, the 76-77 drought came, and I'm leaving out a few steps where they tried to get water from the Russian River. But eventually, 76-77 came along, and they were desperate. Okay, what are they going to do? Think about this. They bought Colorado River water from Metropolitan Water District. And I was involved in working out the contracts. Now, how could they do that? Well, the feds built them a pipeline across the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge. I'll let you think about that in a moment. Marin County didn't build it, the feds built it. Now, see, some of us think that keep the federal money out of this and everybody stays more pure. But in any event, the feds built them a pipeline. It was, many of you maybe remember seeing this. You drive across the bridge and pipeline, that diameter going across the bridge. Okay, where did the water come from? I don't remember the exact path, but did it come through Contra Costa, Wally? And East Bay and the Delta, and now during the drought, there was no water available in the Delta if you didn't already have it. There was no unaccounted for water in the system at that time. They clearly had a need. So we had extra water on the Colorado River. So we sold a portion of our water to Marin County, a very small portion, but enough to save them. And we sold water to Kern County and a few other people. And in effect, they got Colorado River water. It was a great opening of thinking about how we should be doing things. And today you find a lot of exchanges and people thinking about exchanges, about delivering water in different places. You don't buy the actual water, you buy something that's equivalent to it. So the state's aqueduct has in effect become a common carrier. And if people will pay the costs, and actually the department writes down a list every year in its annual report of what you have to pay to use the given portion of the aqueduct. It's just a rate schedule. If you want water delivered at a given location, look it up. Here's what you got to pay. And the department's been wheeling water through the state aqueduct for years. But the kinds of things that are being done are much more elaborate than they were at one time. Now, you may have read in the paper a few years ago that San Diego County and Metropolitan were in a huge uproar that went on for years. And the issue basically was San Diego wanted to buy water from Imperial Valley, not a bad idea, but they wanted to wheel it through Metropolitan's aqueduct, and they wanted to pay what Met felt was not an adequate fee. And so, for the most part, that whole fight was, what's a fair fee? And San Diego had a bunch of numbers that they said, these are the fair numbers. And of course, Met said, no way. And that was one I got in the middle of before I retired. It was interesting to me that San Diego, for the most part, was all by itself among the Met member agencies in that fight. Now, eventually, it got worked out. And I think it's actually happening today in some form. But the issue there really was, what does a member agency of Metropolitan pay to wheel water that they themselves bought, not that the group as a whole bought? When you're a member of an aqueduct system, do you have any special right to wheel it through in your capacity? That kind of stuff. Now, Met had a very tough time with that. They made themselves a lot of bad publicity, which I hope is behind them, because you don't want to have the 800-pound gorilla in the drama who is acting in a way that everybody else is mad at them. Things don't go too well then. So today we've got this sharing of facilities. We've got water marketing has now, in my mind at least, become part of the equation, part of the way in which California, particularly urban California, but also high-valued agriculture, how they will get their future supplies. There's actually been water marketing in this state for years and years. I mean, the Owens Valley scheme of Los Angeles going up to Owens Valley and buying the ranches was essentially a water marketing scheme. Now, they did it in a way that lots of things were done in that way, secretively, heavy-handed. Well, you can't really do that much anymore because of all the openness that's required. But water marketing's been around a long time. And within given stream systems, people have often marketed water on the streams within the Central Valley. If a farmer's rights are beyond what they need, or an irrigation district's rights are beyond what they need for a given year, they sell them to somebody else in the system. What has become much more controversial 10, 15 years ago was the notion that the future urban needs of California should be met by water marketing. That's what really set off a vigorous debate about 10 years ago. We went through several years in the legislature where the question was, should we have generic legislation on water marketing? Should we find what are those common things to all water marketing and put them in a statute and kind of clear the deck so it can go forward? Well, I was opposed to that because, and P. Wilson, when this came up, Governor Wilson was opposed to it also because while it's a nice theory, in practice what you do is you bring in a lot of people who have only a theoretical and future interest. You bring in a lot of critics that you don't really have to work with right now. So My theory was that, and I don't mean to, my personal theory, but the theory I subscribed to was go case by case. If you sit down among those that have the rights and those that want to buy them, you can work out all kinds of things by just taking into account the particular circumstances of that deal. But the moment, and then other people say, for the most part, fine. There may be a few people, like when we did the water bank in the Sacramento Valley in the 91-92 drought, there were third-party impacts that were not adequately dealt with in the small farming communities. And future water marketing from ag needs to take all that into account. But I just read in the paper yesterday that Metropolitan Water District is working out some new marketing arrangements with the Palo Verde Valley out at Blythe and with Imperial Valley, where they're going to pay them some money for a long period of time. In return, they'll get to take some of their Colorado River water during dry periods. These things are going to happen, they should happen, but they should be done in a way in which the deals are negotiated out and as much as possible everybody is treated fairly. That's why we oppose the legislation. Last on this water marketing, I'll just mention that most of California can now be served from the water system. That is, even the farthest parts of the desert, Imperial Valley, Coachella Valley, the high desert, Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, most of California can now be served out of the state federal water system. It's just, to me, it's an interesting point that we've come to. And there's little resistance for people trying to work out deals. The two parts that can't be served out of the system are Marin County and the Monterey Peninsula. I was down in the Monterey Peninsula over the weekend, and I was reminded again of an area that's got its hands full with its future water supply, because they got some real problems down there. They got still population growth. They don't want to build any dams. There's a real no-growth group there who are afraid that more water will make things worse. So I think where they're headed is desalting. They're going to participate in a desalting plant at Moss Landing, probably, and water will be piped over to the Monterey Peninsula. So I wouldn't be a bit surprised if 10 to 15 years from now that will have been built and in operation, and it will be one of the first production that is non-experimental plants in California. There's some in other parts of the country, and certainly in the Middle East, but a production plant that's constructed to last a long, long time and turn ocean water into fresh water, I wouldn't be surprised if the first one will be at Moss Landing for the Monterey Peninsula. And of course, already they're getting in a discussion about others in the area who might want to hook in. So that'll be an interesting debate to follow. So I'm down to my conclusions and observations. I'll try and make these brief and then throw it open to some questions or comments. First, there's no longer unaccounted water in the system. We found that during the droughts, but I think it's probably true or almost true any time now. If you go into the State Water Board today and try and generate a new water right, my guess is there will be a protest from somebody, and it will drag on and maybe forever. Because even during flood flows, there are environmental theories where that extra water coming down the Sacramento River is providing benefits in the bay. I'm not saying there's a scientific conclusion to that fact, but there is a basis for somebody to come into a water rights hearing and protest it. So for all practical purposes, what we've developed is pretty close to what we're going to have. There might be one or two more in off-stream storage reservoirs built. They will get hassled over this issue when they go to the Water Rights Board or the State Water Resource Control Board. So it's an interesting phenomenon we're in. This may be a throwaway, but it's not insignificant. Economics has a way of driving many issues. Water marketing is one of them. You know, people can argue in the abstract all they want in the legislature about how the world might be, but when they really get into a crunch, like during a drought, where you see high values starting to be eroded through shortages, people get a lot more serious about what can they practically do. Water marketing is one of them that I think is going to be driven by economics, or what gets built will be driven by it. I observe and this won't get any cheers. I think population will continue to grow notwithstanding anything else, particularly notwithstanding water issues. And my view is that population growth in this state is now driven by global factors, and truly for better or for worse. We had, I think, 500,000 more people come last year, half here, half came in from somewhere. We are still the fastest growing state. We're still going to reach 50 million people at some point. I can't see anything that's going to stop it. You could vote to stop it, it won't stop it. So anyway, it'll be an interesting debate. And again, I don't know many people think this is a wonderful idea, except the people coming here. You know, most of them have smiles on their faces when they get off the plane. And partly because of that, desalting is going to be necessary. I'm often asked, I'm sure all the water manager asked, what about desalting? Well, it's getting less expensive, but it's still as expensive. But compared to alternatives, it's a lot more reasonable than it was thought years ago. And I think the day will come when there will be production water desalting plants built, possibly in the Bay Area, certainly in the coast and in Southern California. Here's one just to think about. Las Vegas is in the news now because they got a lot of water problems. You think California has a problem? They got it big time over there. They do not have enough water to meet their growth. What are they going to do? Well, they have a hope that eventually they'll be able to buy water from the upper basin. Right now, that is against the law. It's probably against a Supreme Court decree, federal statutes, any number of things. Nevertheless, if you put enough money on the table, lots of things change. And it's conceivable to me that down the road, not right away, but down the road, as long as the people in the upper basin feel as strongly as they do, that's a ways down. But what could happen is Las Vegas could make an arrangement with Southern California to build a desalting plant on the California coast and exchange Colorado River water. That receives the most casual conversation about like I'm making right now. I've never seen a study about it, never heard of a study, but as Las Vegas gets in more and more trouble, if Lake Mead keeps dropping, by next year at this time you will see stories about that kind of stuff. Lake Mead is in dire straits. Las Vegas is, they ought to look at the pictures of the brown lawns in Santa Barbara in 1991. You know, Santa Barbara said you cannot water a lawn in this city. Well, Las Vegas is at the very, very early phases of that learning experience. I'll close with this thought. People want two things very much. They want a reliable water supply. You'll never find the majority voting against their own reliable water supply. And they want environmental protection. And they want that just as much as they want a reliable water supply. The people as a whole, if you could find a way to pull them on this, I'm sure there's just a very strong feeling that people want both. And so water managers and all the other people working with them, lawyers and biologists and the public and the NGOs, everybody's got to figure out how do you take these at times seemingly conflicting goals and harmonize them. And much of the time you can if you sit down and work your way through it. With that, I am going to stop and see if there are any questions or comments. Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned a lot of things changing. There's this whole thing of climate change and changing patterns of hydrology. And you said that you didn't think there was any more water left for appropriation. Do you see any problem with there being over-appropriated water, that there are more rights than there is water, and now with conservation, people want to sell water that they're not using, right? Are these rights, I mean, do we work from where we are now, or?
Well, you work from where the facts are, and what we found at the department was more than half of the people coming into the office to sell us water did not own what they were trying to sell. Quite a bit more than half. They may have a theory, but we want to see a pink slip that's come from the DMV. I mean, we wanted something really solid. What I used to say is, you know, we're going to put out real money, and you're going to get real water coming out of our system. We want to make sure there's real water coming into our system, and it's not something that we're already entitled to. Much of the debate about water marketing is real versus hypothetical water, but there is a lot of real water out there. Now, global warming, my shaky understanding of what they're thinking it might mean for water is we'll get less snow and more precipitation in the spring, which is going, you know, historically Californians have used snowmelt for a significant part of their water supply. Well, if the snowmelt's not there, then you got to get it somewhere. Reservoirs, groundwater basins. It's going to be a tough one to manage. An engineer's initial reaction to global warming is to build bigger reservoirs. I mean, Auburn Dam, which I don't think is going anywhere, is a very logical engineering response to global warming. Think about that. I don't think it's going to happen. George?
Yeah, I have a friend was in the Corps of Engineers who always felt that the Dos Rios Dam decision was a bad decision.
The one not to build it?
Yeah. Governor Reagan made a mistake. I wondered, in all your years, or in the last 20, 30 years, where did we make a wrong decision? Where did the water institutions, Dos Rios, Auburn, the Peripheral Canal, what do you think was the worst case of a bad water decision in all that time?
Keep the door open. I may have to leave in a hurry. The Dos Rios decision, all things considered, was not a bad decision. I worked on it for 3 years. I happened to go down to Metropolitan to be employed because I was involved in briefing them about Dos Rios. Knew a lot about it at one time. Didn't know enough about it. What we eventually found out was what we should have really thought. The geology up there is not very good. Lots of landslides. There's no good dam sites in the North Coast area. There are a lot of fisheries. When I see the way that the Bureau of Reclamation is having to deal with their existing Trinity River division, which diverts water from the Trinity into the Sacramento Valley, I wonder if they still have a division 20 years out, because they have been in a lot of trouble. My feeling about the North Coast is a little bit like a guy who's glad he didn't build a nuclear power plant. Because you know you just have an endless hassle. And I don't know it would have been economical. So in any event, the North Coast, all things considered, it's probably not a great loss, or maybe much of a loss at all. The Peripheral Canal one is a trickier issue. I don't know that I ever knew a biologist that worked on the delta issues, and this may just be because of my narrow friends, but I never knew one that didn't think it was a good idea. I mean, the Peripheral Canal was conceived by engineers and biologists working together, trying to figure out a way to move these large quantities of water around the delta rather than through it, with the assumption that going through it was causing a lot of problems for fisheries, for water quality, and whatnot. I remember I was involved in persuading a Northern California state senator, Ray Johnson, wonderful man, to vote for the Peripheral Canal in the legislature. This was the rational engineer in me coming forward. And I and some others sat down with Ray, and he voted for it. He got beat at the next election. One of the most respected guys in the state senate. He got beat at the next election by an unknown guy because he had voted to send your water to Los Angeles. And this kind of phenomenon went on all over the place. The Peripheral Canal is probably the most poisonous water issue that Californians have ever had to deal with. Think about this little statistic. In Santa Clara County, which gets, I think, 75% of its water from the Delta, something like that, their water board, elected water board, was for the Peripheral Canal. Didn't hide about it, gave speaking things about it, build the Peripheral Canal. It lost in Santa Clara County 89-11, which was a little better than the rest of the Bay Area. 89-11. 9 out of 10 voters in Santa Clara County voted against what their own the water board all got reelected. Why? Because, I mean, this is a theory, the public television and the Cron are very influential throughout the Bay Area. And people were reading every day about those terrible things that Southern California is doing to steal your water. And so people made a distinction. Now, we've had a lot of talk in the 20 years since all that happened about, is there any other way to get at the Peripheral Canal issue? One of the ways that was proposed some years ago was, because of the potential earthquakes leveling the Delta, taking out 10 islands or 5, 10 or whatever, salt rushing in which case everybody's shut down and you have a real catastrophe. I mean, I remember when an island went out, I think it was 1971 in June. There wasn't much pumping going on, not too big a deal. I think Contra Costa County got hurt, but you know, it wasn't a statewide impact. If you lost 5 islands in June in an earthquake, and you have to shut the state and federal systems and Contra Costa Canal, and I mean, I'm not sure what you do. So you can make a great technical case. How you make the political case, I have never figured out, and I've never heard an elected official figure it out. So it's a tough one.
We're not through with droughts, so it might come up again.
You know, there are some other ideas that people are working on to improve the situation in Delta, move water around more efficiently. I'm not aware of anything that has the same long-term water quality benefits as an isolated channel, as a new channel. But I'm also not aware of anything that's more controversial. So, yes, sir.
From Las Vegas to Los Angeles, if we can call it a corridor or some sort, going through a couple of deserts along the way. Very low population right now in Inyo County and anything north and south of the Owens Valley. What is California's policy about planning for that area in case population from both Los Angeles as well as from California converge into that desert towns, make the desert bloom basically? What is the policy existing today and what do you see will be happening in the near future, especially associated with climate change? That's in the Sierra Shadows. The impact will probably be less than the rest of the California in that region.
Well, the state did pass a new statute a few years ago that said that a new development has to demonstrate it has enough water supply. Now, like most statutes, this has some ambiguity to it, and not everybody is, you know, it's not totally effective. But I think it's probably a step in a direction of a more rational statewide approach to keeping the desert from just becoming one, well, more of a sprawl than it is. I mean, you can look back and ask yourself, if people had known years ago what they know now, would they even have let some of that happen? But historically in this state, land use planning has done at the county level. And there's just been a lot of political strength to keep it from going up to the state level. That particular new statute is one of the few that I'm aware of that really tries to address that question. But I don't think it's the end of the debate. I think it's almost inevitable. I mean, as people drive through the Antelope Valley to skiing and they start to see all that taking place and they see that there isn't enough water right now to do all that, I would assume people are going to find a more rational way to deal with some of this. Where I personally think the population growth is awfully hard to control is in the already developed cities or urban areas, because you can always build up. And it's pretty hard to argue about that. I mean, there's a lot of arguments to do it right now. So the thing that'll get under control first will be, quote, urban sprawl.
There's a wild card about the so-called nuclear waste province, which is in the Las Vegas Valley. The gradient is going to the south, the Death Valley.
Well, you know,
most people want to protect that, but at the same time, it's a groundwater as well as the climate change.
Yeah, the climate change, if it really starts to materialize, and you see some data today that could be what we're seeing, it's going to force a debate. I mean, I'm one of those, when I fly into Las Vegas, I don't think, isn't this wonderful? I'm in awe of what's gone on over there. Right. That's the same kind of thinking that drove a lot of things in this state in the past.
On behalf of the Groundwater Resources Association of California, I want to thank you for mentioning groundwater. and ask if perhaps you could speculate on how groundwater basins can be integrated more fully into the state water system, particularly since there's no state or federal control.
You know, my sense of it is that we pretty much know what we've got in groundwater basins, and we've got an awful lot, and what we've got to do is work out the arrangements to use that. And the basic approach is to put ourselves in a position that we can draw them down in dry periods and refill them in the wetter periods. And the refilling is going to be both natural and by direct recharge, which has been going on for years. But this is a major way we're going to get through future droughts, is through using our groundwater basins, with expression conjunctively, more than we've been doing it historically. We've been doing it a lot historically. I mean, the groundwater people can be proud of a long history in this state, in Southern California, Santa Clara Valley, Alameda County, out in the Livermore Valley. There's been a lot of groundwater management going on. One of the reasons that I personally had a problem with state legislation on groundwater management is it struck me what you would do is start a huge fight and a bureaucracy without a whole lot to show for it at the end of the day. I wasn't sure that we weren't already able to do what needs to be done through negotiation and authorities that exist. This is just a thought about going to the legislature. When you go to the legislature, it's best to narrowly define what you're asking for. The broader you make it, the more people you bring into your process who have some other axe to grind. One of my treasured memories of George Deukmejian, first year I worked for him, I happened to be in his office on something else, but he was just getting rid of another issue, and the then pro tem of the Senate, David Roberti, was jerking the governor around, and I think that's a technical term in this case. He was giving the governor a lot of trouble. And so the chief of staff said to the governor, "Governor, I think we just need to call him in here and ask him, what is it you want? You know, let's get it out. What is it you want?" And the governor kind of looked out for a moment, and he said, "No, I don't think so." He said, "If I tell him I want A and B, he's going to say, oh, well, I want C and D, and I'm sure we can now work together, Governor." And the governor's point was, that place works through leverage. And the more you ask for, the more opportunities there are for somebody to leverage you. And so that's on broad groundwater legislation. You bring in a lot of people. And it's true of water marketing, too. In fact, I thought it was impossible doing water marketing. There's too many people would come in. Yes, sir.
What's being done at the state level on considering the vulnerability of any of the major water systems to a terrorist attack? And, you know, the response and recovery to such an attack and terror.
I'm going to tell you what I know, and this is one case. I sometimes tell you more than I know. In this case, I'm going to stop when I tell you what I do. I have discussed that with a few of the water managers just because I was curious, and I'm convinced there is a very active effort to try and stay on top of that. But it's something that, in all candor, they do not want to talk about. But I can assure you it's not being neglected. Anybody else, or is it Joe?
Pursue the groundwater issue a little bit. You talked about negotiation, the difficulties of getting statewide legislation, which I think we're all well aware of, painfully, some of us painfully aware of. But when you look at what it's taken to manage some of these basins, like the recent Mojave case and some of the Southern California basins that have been adjudicated, that's a pretty inefficient, expensive way. I mean, is that what you think we're destined for the rest of the state?
I hope not. I mean, one base we have to build on is there are quite a few basins with their own statute that are pretty good. There are other basins, I forget how many, but are under adjudication where there is some flexibility in the adjudication to do what's rational. There are a few, and I haven't thought about the Mojave for a while, but I think about the time I was retiring was when they were starting to come down with some kind of goofy stuff there, weren't they? And, you know, in most cases where there is something really unconscionable or kind of wacko going on, after you've made the case for several years that this makes no sense, you can start to find some allies to correct it. You can never do it on the abstract or the theory that this might happen. You kind of have to demonstrate this isn't working and it makes no sense. And that may be where you go with Mojave. I sure hope that we don't go through a series of others like that, where you get some kind of strange things come out of the courts. Yeah.
But, you know, there was another strange thing. This guy by the name of Brackpool had an idea for the Cadiz surplus Colorado. And that, not that Metropolitan is, but I mean, how close that came to getting approved. You know, when absolutely, in terms of scientific knowledge, there was just a fear on the part of environmental organizations to actually say anything that they knew with their own eyes. And how close that came to happening actually really scared me into wanting to get involved in water planning. And do you see that kind of, well, like we have this seminar here where we actually talk about some of these things and developing knowledge about what's happening. And then we look and we see that water planning sometimes moves, you know, without any respect at all to science. And do you have hope for a connection between science and planning?
Well, I do, in the sense that the whole process today is much more open than it used to be. It has to be open. I mean, this isn't that people are volunteering to be open. That's the way it has to be. I think that plan, the Cadiz program that Keith Brackpool was promoting, one could argue it did not come as close to fruition as you feared. The fact that a board would approve it, that's a step in a process. I don't remember there was any litigation against it at that point, or was there? I mean, that would have been litigated by people who were genuinely afraid about the impact on those basins and the resources. I think they thought they were further along. That was one of Brackpool's frustrations. He was trying to do it right in a sense. You know, he spent quite a bit of money doing a study. He spent more Don't get me down that road. That's another one I actually know more about than I should. But But I never sensed at Met that there was a whole lot of enthusiasm. Now, he was pressing pretty hard, but even if the board had approved it, that was just one step in a long process. You can find lots and lots of projects where boards have approved things that don't go anywhere. So anytime the environmental community is strongly opposed to something, and there was starting to get a strong opposition out there, hadn't been initially, which is, I think, one reason that Keith Brackpool had gone as far as he had. It sort of evolved, but anytime you have really tough, strong opposition, you tend to get the state and federal resource agencies lined up with the NGOs. I think it's inevitable you get litigation. These things then just come to a grinding halt while the courts sort them out. Never been a one of them that moved quickly. And there's never been one in which they didn't get more and more information that concerns somebody. So I think you probably didn't need to be quite as fearful as you indicate you were. But on the other hand, if there's values you want to protect, then you want to be very vigilant about it. Yes?
One thing that I've been reading about lately is water privatization. And I'm wondering if you have any comments about that, if you think that's really going to continue. It seems to be that some districts, some cities have gone that route and then backtracked.
Well, the question was about water privatization, and most recently the city of Stockton started to privatize its water and sewage treatment with an English company. Got sued, and it's all kind of turned. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I am on the board of directors of a company called California Water Service Company, which has about 450,000 services in the state and is a private water company. We looked at that deal before it got started and said, nah, I don't think so. We buy water companies from time to time, municipal water companies, usually where the Public Utilities Commission asks us to do it because they're struggling so much, they can't do with water quality what they're trying to do. They want us, because we've got a lot of capability, to come in and take it over. So private water companies, I think, fill an important small niche in this state, but privatization of already publicly owned facilities, I think that's a very tough nut to crack. It's a difficult policy issue. You know, you can make cases why this is more efficient, but in the several years before I retired, we had guys would come in and talk to us about privatization. I never heard a whole lot that made much sense to me. To me, it was usually guys that had found somebody to give them a lot of money to go out and explore this. So there's probably going to be something privatized that's now public, but I'd be very surprised if it happens on a large scale. I think public agencies, generally speaking, are doing a great job. They've got the advantage of, you know, they have a public process. They've got boards of directors that are elected, all that kind of stuff. Our reverse of that, I mean, we, as a private company, we have a PUC process that is very open that we go through. So we're not just off doing our own thing. We're heavily regulated ourselves.
David, I've heard you talk verbally about 3 or 4 times before. I think I remember from a couple of those talks that you threw out figures representing the fraction of water used by agriculture versus municipal and industrial as being about 80-20 in the States. And since you mentioned that agriculture was topping off and maybe even declining its water, does that explain your optimism about the water marketing scene as answering a lot of the problems?
Well, I think, yeah, there's a lot of water out there being used by agriculture, some of it marginal agriculture, that over time could help the urban area meet a portion of its need. And I think it's happening right now, gradually, deals being made. During a drought, it will happen on an interim basis in a more accelerated way. But I think it's almost inevitable as a law of economics that the money drives these things. And if you give a farm, I mean, when we did the drought water bank in '91, initially we had a big uproar. If I get time to tell, I know I'm running past my time and I don't want to. Well, when the '91 drought came along, Pete Wilson had just come in as governor. We were meeting with him several times a week because he said, I know I got a budget problem, but this water problem is worse than the budget problem. You know, it was the front page of every paper every day. The water community sort of decided right away they had to start buying water from agriculture in the Sacramento Valley. Some of them went up in the Sacramento Valley, started trying to do deals with farmers. We all collectively, I don't think anyone made the decision, we collectively made the decision somebody needs to take this effort over and buy the water for everybody, bring some rationale to it. So we became the broker at the department. And the governor told us, form a drought water bank and go out and buy the water and sell it, which we did. I remember one of the first meetings I was in after we formed it, and this goes to the part of the question. I got summoned over to the governor's office. He's got 3 heavy hitters in the ag community there complaining because we are only offering $120 an acre foot, which is what we had kind of all collectively decided among the water people was going to bring in some water, but wasn't overdoing it. So they told the governor, Kennedy's only offering $120. We need $300 or we can't do this. And I could see that, you know, the governor didn't want to be in this meeting any more than I did. But anyway, I said, Governor, let me take these people over to state ag, because the state ag director was there too. We went over there and where we had more time to talk. I said, here's the deal. You may be right next week that we have to pay $300. What I know today, before I came over here, is that there's a line of farmers outside our office wanting to sell us water at $120. And as long as they're willing to do that, that's the market. If we don't get enough before doing it this way, we'll start going up. We may get to 300. If you don't want to sell it for 300, it was rice water, don't sell it to us. We're not badgering you at all. Have a nice day. I mean, these were the governor's close friends. And, you know, frankly, they became my good friends too. But they thought they were going to come in and you know, cut a fat hog. And I said, no, we got a line outside. Well, it turned out we thought we'd have to go to 150 maybe. And we'd put a favored nations clause in the contracts. We eventually did 350 purchase contracts. We put a favored nations clause that basically said we would pay anybody what we paid the first guy. Now, I know that's not the way economics necessarily works, but that's the way farmers work. Well, it turned out we bought 800,000 acre feet for $120 an acre foot. Now, a lot of things happened, but the next year, the same farmers that had wanted to sell, that sold us water for 120, were calling us up and coming in. Hey, you going to do it this year too? No. I said, we may buy some water. We wound up buying water for about $80, I think, that second year. And, of course, we didn't buy near as much. Anyway, that's what made me realize there really is some economic law here. And sometimes we bend it and break it. But it does kind of force you to do things that make sense. I'll say one other little, and if anybody needs to leave, I will not be offended if they get up and leave. But this, to me, was kind of an interesting little story about Bill Bradley, who was then senator from New Jersey, and some others who will remain unnamed, were in the press saying the governor should declare an emergency and take over the water of the state and reallocate it. And this became all of a sudden a battle cry on the front page of quite a few newspapers. Governor should declare an emergency and take over the water and give it to who they need it. And so, you know, the next day I'm in a meeting when the governor says, should I do this or can I do this? And I found myself being the one that responded, and I said, yes, you can do that. You have authority under the Emergency Services Act to take property if there is an emergency. And you can take darn near anything. But you have to pay for it. You cannot take it without compensation. I said, if we do it this way, we will spend the next 20 years in court with $20 billion worth of litigation. Let's find another way to do it. And that's when we came up with the water bank. We and a lot of other people came up with the water bank. So, the governor immediately picked up on, no, we're not going to start taking stuff that we have to pay for. It gets awfully expensive. People, what you thought was $100 becomes $500 to a jury. Thank you.